Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in this video is we're going to be looking at dialogue, and we're going to be looking at just a general overview of the techniques that are used in dialogue, and also give a bit of a definition about how it's used, where it's used, and why it's important for you when you're looking at doing a response where you have to refer to dialogue, what importance dialogue has and what you'll be able to get out of it and what it will add to your response. So we'll just go through very briefly about what is the main reason we look at dialogue and what effect it adds. We'll look in depth at it as well, and basically look at the methods and language techniques by which it is delivered. Now, what I mean by that is that when people speak, they speak with a variety of different ways, and there are, of course, language techniques which basically name what those methods of speaking are, and we'll have a look at those. We'll also look at where it is used. Now, generally, the use of dialogue is used for film and play studies. So when you're studying a film or when you're studying a play, you'll be mainly looking at how dialogue is used, particularly for a play that you'll find, because of the fact that they are mainly comprised of dialogue with a few actors moving around here and there. And it can also include techniques which are used in speeches as well. So if you're looking at speech and how speech projects meaning and how speech does all these various ways of language is used, you'll be looking at how it's conveyed, and particularly how it interacts with audiences and things like that. And that's mainly the reason why we look at sort of dialogue techniques in speeches as well, because they are having a conversation with the audience. And even though it's delivered in a way that may seem like a monologue, it is still talking to people. So that is why we're still looking at it in the form of dialogue. Now, why look at dialogue techniques? Well, basically, it's important for what is said, but it's also the way in which it is said, and which also creates a bit of meaning and reflection as well. How it's spoken, and especially this is the case in theatre, and when you're looking at plays, is another very strong consideration. Now, what that means is essentially, yes, it's important what characters say, and it's important to tell the story for what they are saying, but also the way in which it's said gives us a bit of an insight on how the story is structured, what sort of meaning that the author of the text is trying to create. So if you're looking at it in terms of a play, you're obviously looking at it in terms of the playwright, and what they're trying to do. So if you've got someone, for instance, doing an aside or a soliloquy, then there's something that they need to convey to the audience, which is important, and it's important that the other characters on stage don't know about this, because it is them sharing their thoughts. So the way it is structured is quite important, because obviously, yes, it does sort of help the storyline flow, but also it may be important at a particular point to actually go through and say that they're outpouring their thoughts, because this is important to the story, this is important for the audience who are watching it to get an idea about their character and who they are and what they're doing, and basically it creates meaning through that. You need to also be able to discuss this and have the relevant technique. Now, the main simple reason for this to be required is because of the fact that you want to be very specific, so that you're able to analyze it with more definition. Now, what I mean by that is essentially, if you're trying to talk about, we'll go back to the example of soliloquy, and you don't know the exact word for it, and you're trying to think what it is, then if you say, oh, he goes up on the stage and he talks and no one else can hear him, it's a lot more vague, and it doesn't really get to the point quite as quickly as if you just refer to it as soliloquy, because your mark will immediately know that that's exactly what you're talking about, and you don't need to explain it to them. Whereas if you're trying to explain it, yes, you can do that if you're stuck on technique, but it's more specific, and certainly it sounds a lot more detailed, and certainly a lot better if you use the correct language technique and the correct term for it. So it's always good to have the appropriate definition and the appropriate name of the language technique that you're trying to refer to, especially, as I said, because of the fact that you'll be trying to communicate with someone and you want it to be as specific as possible, and certainly it will save you room having to go through and analyze it more. Now, what you're also trying to do is you're trying to engage an audience, and particularly when you're using dialogue, and quite often this is the point of dialogue, is you're engaging an audience. Now, you may say, yes, but a novel or a text which isn't necessarily speaking to an audience will do this as well, and they're not doing it necessarily to engage an audience, it's more because we want to know what they're saying. But really they're engaging someone, as in they're talking to someone else, and we learn more about them. And we as the audience are engaged by this. So even though, yes, all texts engage an audience, whether they be a reader, whether they be an audience as in an auditorium audience or a theatre audience or whatever it may be. Everything is still trying to get a reaction out of whoever is watching them, whoever's seeing them, whatever it may be. And by using dialogue, we learn more about them. And certainly it's about the characters, not necessarily the author, having a conversation with the audience. That's the thing to remember, is this is the characters here having the conversation and not whoever has written the story having a conversation with us. And they do this for a number of means. First of all, rhetorical questions. As in, they engage the audience by simply getting us to think by asking rhetorical questions. Now, you'd be familiar with these, I'm sure. Questions not requiring an answer. And they are basically there literally to provoke thought. And if they ask lots of rhetorical questions, then it starts to get the audience guessing. And particularly when the rhetorical questions are one they're asking about themselves or asking about another, it means that we can start to feel, a sense of tension, a sense of conflict, and certainly a number of different things can be felt. Now, this is also a technique used in prose, but particularly for dialogue, it's much more effective, and especially if you're looking at it in terms of a speech, then rhetorical questions sort of definitely show a willingness to engage the audience and get them to basically provoke their stream of thought and their stream of consciousness. Emotive language. Now, obviously, because a speech comes from someone's point of view, the language which is going to be used is going to be emotive, particularly if they're a passionate speaker about what they're trying to say. Now, if you're looking at it in terms of prose, yes, prose uses emotion as well. But the one thing to remember about this is because of the fact that you're looking at characters, there's less of a conscious effort, I guess, to not show something like bias, for instance. So if you're reading a work, then the author's role is to tell a story, and it's to tell a story in a way that, yes, you can filter it through what they want to see, basically, what the author wants to show you. However, the author's role is to tell a story, whereas the character's role is to be basically the centerpiece, is to be someone who wears their heart on their sleeve or whatever their role in the story is. And through showing emotion, we start to see how they feel, how they react to things. And emotive language, particularly for dialogue, comes across more than what it would normally in prose. And so looking at it and understanding basically the way that they talk, the way that they speak to others, the way they may irrationally or rationally use emotive language to communicate a point, is something that will also help to give you a bit of depth about the character and particularly the words that they're saying. Now, balance is an interesting one, and certainly one of these techniques that comes across in dialogue, and particularly in the way that people speak. Now, balanced wording basically compares two opposites and writes them in such a way where they're sort of equally balanced. You sort of think of it like a scale. And a line, for instance, "I came to bury Caesar, not to praise him," is sort of creates this artistic sort of balance between the two words. So in this case, it's between to and not to. And this line comes from Julius Caesar, which is a play by Shakespeare. And to say that I came to bury Caesar, not to praise him, sort of creates a bit of a contrast and a contradiction between the two things that he's saying. And it sort of helps to create a bit of poetry and a bit of an effect. Now, in terms of the context of what this line is trying to say, well, in this case, it's poetically trying to say that I come here to put this man to rest. I don't do this to say how good he is. And particularly in the stage of the play where this is set, this is at a time where people are trying to cut Caesar down to size. And so he's trying to say, well, you know, I'm not one of these people who's trying to support him. I'm just trying to bury him here. And even though he does praise him in his speech, he sort of tries to introduce it like to say, oh, well, I'm not really trying to do that. So it basically helps to create a bit of poetry in the way the words are used, and certainly something you can talk about. A climax and anti-climax. So a speaker may lead to or away from a climactic statement, as in when someone's trying to speak, just as the way that an author may be trying to convey meaning through the language that they use. They are trying to, I guess, lead towards something where they reveal the big shock statement at the end, where through their speech they start with a very small sort of almost laconic speech, and then they sort of start to build up towards this big shocking revelation that they're trying to make, or indeed an anti-climax when they don't do that. So they try and almost make out like they're making a big outrageous statement, and then suddenly they just throw something in at the end and it's sort of like a little joke. So they may also be essentially trying to make a climactic or anticlimactic statement, and you can look at how this is conveyed through speech and how this is conveyed through dialogue, and particularly, as I said, what it's trying to say. With climax, and particularly with an audience, and this is essentially what we're looking at here, by building towards this climax, you're getting the audience moving further and further towards the edge of their seat. And certainly with an anticlimax, you send them almost spiraling straight back again. So this is what this is trying to do, is it's trying to really hook someone in and get them following what's happening. All right. So those are basically the ways dialogue engages with an audience. But let's have a look at actually the forms of it and how it is conveyed and how it is spoken. And as I said, not all forms of dialogue involve two speakers. Now, the literal meaning of the word dialogue can involve one speaker. It doesn't necessarily have to have two. So by looking at how it is used and how it is how someone speaks is quite important, and certainly in the context of what the text is trying to do. And whether it be a film or whether it be a piece of theatre, it doesn't necessarily matter, because dialogue has different purposes. So, but in plays especially, this is where you will really see it come out, because they will shape the structure of performance. And certainly if you have characters making numerous asides or numerous soliloquies, for instance, it becomes more centered on them, and we start to learn more about their motivations and the things that are inspiring them to do the things that they do in the play, and certainly things that we wouldn't get unless they gave us a quick aside to really tell us what they're trying to do. So it may be, for instance, a monologue. Now, a monologue is slightly different from the asides that I just mentioned, and that a monologue is purely a performance by a solo performer in which they're speaking to someone who is not there. So if you see someone performing a monologue, now this is more important if you're doing drama, for instance, and certainly for those who do solo performances. But basically it is a performance where you're speaking to someone, addressing someone, almost like I'm doing now. I'm speaking to someone, and even though you're watching on screen there, I'm really addressing no one, because I'm addressing a camera that's right in front of me. And so this monologue is speaking to someone who I'm imagining to be there, as in it is you who is watching it from the other side of the screen. A soliloquy, as I just mentioned, an actor speaks without others hearing what is said. And this is to just communicate their inner thoughts, their thought processes, all these things that are motivating them. It may also break the fourth wall, where basically a character speaks to and acknowledges the audience directly. Now, this is slightly, again, different from a soliloquy, whereas a soliloquy, they're still sort of not acknowledging the audience, they're just sort of telling them what's happening. They're opening up their brains, essentially, and letting their thoughts come out. Whereas breaking the fourth wall is essentially going up to the audience and saying, how are you going? How's your night been? Are you enjoying the hospitality? All those sorts of things. And so acknowledging the audience is there and having them actually become part of the story. And that's essentially what it's trying to do. It may also involve looking at their diction, as in the way that they speak. So looking at the language and certainly the way a particular character speaks. Now, this can include certain things. For instance, an accent. So if someone speaks with an English, Australian, Chinese accent, and certain ways that they speak, as in certain ways that words are enunciated and pronounced, all those sorts of things are part of this. And certainly when you're looking at the diction of their dialogue, you'll start to learn a bit more about their character, particularly if you see things like colloquialisms. But also it can look at things like their status, for instance. So if you look at Cockney English, for instance. Now, Cockney English is something that is essentially the lower class forms of speech, as in it was language which was associated with lower classes for people who weren't necessarily well educated, all those sorts of things. And so this sort of forms a bit about their character and really informs a bit about them. And gesture, basically unspoken forms of communication, yet it's still communicating. Now, it's still dialogue in a sense, because you can still say things without using words at times, and certainly the gestures which are used while someone is speaking. So, for instance, if you notice when I speak, I use my hands a lot because I'm trying to sort of push forward or convey what I'm trying to say. And I'll use various gestures to sort of reinforce bits that are important. I'll point to things, I'll do these sorts of things. And that's essentially a way of communicating, is by pointing to this. I'm saying this is important. Look at this line. This is what I'm referring to. So it is a part of it as well. Now, you may also look at this in terms of narration. You think, well, where does this fit in? Well, narration sort of fits into a number of these categories, and depending on what it's doing, whether it's the narrator is in the play or whether or not, or in a film for that matter, or any other kind of text, whether they're in it or not in it, its form can vary. And certainly you would look at these things in terms of what narration is doing. However, the narration is a separate thing. It's basically a method of storytelling rather than a form of dialogue. So even though it is someone speaking, it doesn't really form a part of this. Now, obviously when you're looking at the forms and all the things that is important about the way a character speaks, main thing you'll be looking at is the words themselves, as in how what they're saying contributes to the story. And certainly if you're looking at Shakespeare, for instance, then it's almost everything. Now, when you're studying basically the content, you're using the same sort of techniques as you would if you're studying prose and normal forms of text, which means you'll refer to your usual sorts of things like personification and metaphors and similes and so on and so forth. Dialogue techniques basically look more at the manner in which something is said. So you'll still look at the words and what each character reveals in their dialogue, but you'll be mainly looking at, if we're looking in terms of dialogue techniques, the manner in which something is said and the method of communicating with the audience. So, but especially with plays and films and these sorts of visual texts, which also use sound, where someone is able to talk and be able to communicate through voice and through things that are being said, then the manner in which they say things is important, because obviously we can hear it. Now, if we're reading it, yes, that is also a different way of looking at things. But in terms of the manner in which it's said, and certainly there are notes, and you'll see notes when you're referring to dialogue, if you're reading it, about how it is said, and especially if it's how it is said without it becoming obvious. So if someone's shouting and it's obvious from the way it's written that they're shouting, then often they won't write in brackets shouting. But if it's something where it may not necessarily be obvious that they are shouting, then they'll write in brackets shouting, to sort of show that the manner of how they're speaking is important, and it's important that they're shouting and their voice is raised. The same as with method, and all those techniques I just mentioned before, then the method is also a crucial bit of this, because when you're looking at the method of communication, if they're going off and revealing their thoughts without the other characters knowing, for instance, in the case of aside, or if they're talking to someone through monologue, it sort of again communicates in different ways. So each of these different methods and techniques of basically speaking have their own way of creating meaning. Now that's basically it for the introduction and certainly the background to the various techniques used in dialogue. So until next time, I'll see you later.